Okay, good morning, everybody. Why don't we continue in Sif Yud Daled? Um, he writes, "V'im natal hamoches." We're talking about a tax collector who deals in stolen property because, again, it's more historical than anything else. The last couple of halachos having to do with people who are known bandits or ganovim, and you're forced in some way to deal with them. So what we're basically saying is that you have to try and make sure that you don't get any benefit from any kind of financial exchanges that you make with them. And if you're forced to, the last halacha that we saw is that if you feel compelled that you have to engage with them in some kind of commercial trade, make sure that you give everything to them at cost so that you don't end up benefiting in any way from them. And he writes as follows in Sif Yudalid: "V'im natal hamoches es chamoro, v'hechzer lo chamor acher." Let's say the tax collector takes your donkey and gives you a different donkey. I guess that would be a common practice, is that they would round up a whole bunch of livestock, and then you wouldn't get back necessarily your own donkey, you'd get back somebody else's donkey. V'chein listim, or let's say you get held up by bandits and they strip you of your clothes, but they give you different clothes, I guess. So the halacha is, in that situation, Rashai litla vihi shalo. You're allowed to keep it as yours, im yadua shenisyashu habalim, if it's known that the original owner has given up hope of retrieving their garment or their donkey. Ve'eno kinehene min hagezel. And you're not benefiting, it's not considered to be benefiting from stolen property. Hoel velo nasnu alo elachilufei shalo. And he basically gives two arguments. Number one, it was only given in exchange for something else that is at least of equal value. The ganovim would not give you something of greater value. And furthermore, ve'eno yodeya bevadai shezu gezuli. And you don't know 100% for sure that it's stolen, even though it's assumed to be stolen. The imhu vatik, but basically you're probably going to have a bad feeling about the whole thing, wearing some other guy's clothes or using someone else's donkey. So therefore, if you are a vatik, the word vatik means from the older generation, meaning that you're pure and you want to do the right thing. Machmir al atzmo, so, and you want to be stringent upon yourself. You don't want to have anything to do with stolen goods. So machzira liba aleha harisholim shelo lehanus min hagezel. Try to track down the original owner so that you don't end up benefiting from stolen property. Sha'af shenasnuhu lo chalifei shelo harei shelo kvar gazlu. And the argument being that the reason why you would want to try and make restitution is because even though you had to relinquish your own garment or your own donkey, but they basically stole your items, and that doesn't justify your, keeping something that they stole from someone else. Va'afim lo haisazu etzlam, efshar shelo hayu machzirim lo. And if this the af imlo haisazu etzlam, and even though this item was not with them, efshar shelo hayu machzirim lo shelo v'nimtza nena b'likichaso osa. In other words, maybe you would never get back your original item. And it turns out that you're benefiting because you're able to use someone else's item in exchange for the item that you lost. And after all, it's assumed to be stolen. And therefore, while technically you can exempt yourself by saying that I'm not really benefiting from this stolen good, and the owner has already had yeush, and it's already exchanged hands from the ganovim, and so therefore I'm within my rights to keep it, based on everything that we've learned up until now. But if you feel that you want to do the right thing and you feel uncomfortable, so then there is basis for you also to return it. And he expresses the reason why a person would feel even halachically uncomfortable with retaining it, because lamaisa it's assumed to be stolen. Okay, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov over here. Vihi shalo. So we basically said over here, Rashai litla vihi shalo. You're allowed to consider the garment that they give you or the donkey that they give you now yours. Velo amrinan, and we don't say kevin demistama lo miritzonu nasan lo hamoches chamor zeh. He says, what we don't say is as follows, that since you really don't want this other donkey that is being, or this other garment that is being given to you, and it's almost as if you were forced this, you had this thing forced upon you. And we learned before that if you take something from a ganaf forcibly, then it's not considered to be an exchange of domain. It's considered almost to be still in the possession of the ganaf, and therefore you're not allowed to benefit from it. Kamash malan degam zenechshav shini rishusum mechira kevin shenosun lo tachashalo. The chiddush is that it is considered yours because even though they foisted it upon you, they forced you to take the donkey. It's now considered yours because you've exchanged it for your own donkey, and therefore you shouldn't feel any halachic guilt of thinking that it's not yours. It is yours halachically. And it's also telling you that it's like a complete exchange, and therefore you're allowed to consider it to be yours. Now, but that's only provided that you know that the owner has relinquished any hope of retrieving it. The owner has had yiyush. And b'shulchan aruch simin shin samach tes if yud kasav decheskas shenis yashu haba mimena ad kam l'shana. The Rav Shulchan Aruch has departed from the language of the Shulchan Aruch because the Shulchan Aruch says you're allowed to assume that the owner has had yeyush, and here the Rav Shulchan Aruch says you have to know that they had yeyush. So that's a little bit of a departure, and it's not clear why he departs from the original language. Umashma degam im lo yadinan bevadai mikol makom chazaka shenisyash mimenu habalim. And so that's really the question that he's asking. B'das hataz sham dezeh omer davka b'moches Yisrael that's lo amrinan destam gzela misyash mimenu habalim. And so the Taz writes over there in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch that the reason why you're allowed to assume that the owner had yeyush is because the tax collector is Jewish. And I guess maybe there's a greater assumption that because he's he explains Aval Hasmasim and Shin Samachesiv Katan Gimel Spirle the Dinza Omer Gamba Moches Nachri. Da'afim stam nigzal nilistim o mochsim nachrim eno miyayish mishum da'akum daini begei usam. He says the argument is, will Gentile tax collectors, can you actually sue them in a Gentile court? And perhaps the argument is that maybe under certain political conditions, you might be the victim who had his property confiscated from the non-Jewish tax collector might be able to start a whole court case against him in the government. Whereas a Jewish tax collector, apparently maybe in certain historical periods, the government didn't care as much about what Jewish tax collectors did, because they basically said that's an internal affair between you and the Jews in your community, and we're not getting involved. And so therefore, maybe that's the reason why there's a differentiation in language, is that in the Shulchan Aruch, it's referring to a situation where you can assume that the owner was miyayish because the tax collector is Jewish, whereas over here, the Rav Shulchan Aruch is talking about where the tax collector is non-Jewish, and therefore it's more likely that the victim will not have yeyush. Mikol makom shayni hachad abalam harishonim roim shahamoches nosin is ksuso achamor la'acher Imkein vaday misyayish mehachamor o hakesus. However, if the victim sees how the tax collector has wantonly just disposed of his property by giving it to others, so then certainly, says the Sma, the owner will have Yeush. And va'ayin bekuntras achron sharav poligal hasma va'ainon bibiurim. And he basically says continue researching this subject, because there may be differences in halacha depending upon whether the tax collector is a Jew or a non-Jew. And as I've pointed out before, this is all not really germane to halacha l'maisa, because we don't live in these kinds of medieval settings where you have someone like the sheriff of Nottingham who can indiscriminately go ahead and just confiscate property. Shenisyashu haba'olim. Okay. So he says, and he says, but if you're a vatik, if you're a righteous person, a pious person who wants to go above the letter of the law, and you don't want to benefit from gezel, so then you should try to track down the owner and try to return it back to that person. So I'm really skimming through it. I really don't want to go through it in any tremendous depth, because as you can tell, this is not really a very practical halacha. Okay, let's go on to test.
Rabbi, can I ask whether what happens not rarely might be a practical application? If someone takes your coat from the cloakroom and they leave theirs, the whole question of, are you allowed to take theirs either then or even 30 days later? Can you keep it because they've given up hope of getting their own coat? And basically it's a coat for coat exchange. It sounds quite similar to this situation.
Right. We did look into that. Does anyone remember? We did this when we learned the laws of Hashavas Aveda. And I believe that what we said was that under most circumstances, you're not allowed to keep the other coat for yourself, even though the other person has taken your coat by accident. It's very questionable in halacha whether you're allowed to even benefit from that other person's coat, because he may not have had yeush, right? So that's the we did this when we learned the laws of Hashavas Aveda, and if anyone wants to Google, if you want to Google that, Paul, I'm pretty sure that we looked it up in a there was an essay that we saw about Hashavas Aveda, which talked about that very case, but we saw this months and months ago. So,
but I wonder whether, I hear at the moment he hasn't had years, but is there something about after a period of time, whether it be 30 days, and you put up a sign and says that if you haven't claimed it, then it's no longer yours? I think I used to see that. I think I used to see that even in the cloakroom outside the kollel and the bayit.
Yeah, but that's a convention that a building owner is allowed to create at the outset, but that's not the standard halacha.
Okay.
It is permitted for a building owner or a person who's control of a piece of property to basically say that we maintain the right to take possession of anything that's left here for more than 30 days.
Okay, right. So it doesn't really line up with the case here because because of how it was taken and how you would give up from a person who steals your donkey.
Right. Yeah, here we're talking about a scenario that doesn't really exist in the modern world. Thankfully, it doesn't exist because people have legal recourse against people like this. But I suppose in theory it's possible if you were going to be living in the barrio, back in the early 20th century, and things were rough, in our parents' time. Okay.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Tesvav. V'chol zeh shehamoches hu gazlin b'moches nachrio afilu Yisrael, ela she'amad me'ilav shalom achmas hamelech. So all of these halachas that we've been discussing up until now have to do with a person who is a bona fide gazlan, because he is a tax collector that is going beyond the king's rules and is basically willy-nilly just confiscating people's property. Or alternatively, the king basically doesn't care and tells him he can take whatever he wants. And the king basically says, I'm turning a blind eye, just get whatever you want to take from your subjects, you can take, like a land baron. Avol, meches shepasak oso hamelech litol davar katsuv. But let's say there is a fixed tax that the king says that every person has to pay the equal tribute. V'hamid moches Yisrael legavosa lemelech. And the king appoints a Jewish tax collector. V'noda sha'adam zen ne'eman. And it is known that this person is a trustworthy fellow. Ve'eno mosif klum al ma shegozer hamelech. And he never takes more than what the king has fixed as the tax for his subjects, whether it's, when X number of drunkats or rubles per year, or a certain fixed percentage of how much you have to pay. So in that kind of scenario, Eino becheskas gazlan, lefi shedina malchus din. He says the tax collector is not a gazlan. I mean, people who work for the CRA will be relieved, right? Because the law of the land is the law. Dina de malchus, dina, as we've seen many times. Mipnei shekol haaretz lamelechu. Because after all, the entire land really belongs to the kingdom or belongs to the government. Uviyado ligzor shelo yehena adam me'artzo elamidaito sheyitain kitzvasa. And the king, therefore, has a right to decree that no man may benefit from his land without being granted permission by first giving his allotted amount. And I guess, if we were to analyze political theory, like on what basis does a government have a right to tax its subjects, the answer is that the government gives everyone a right to live in its country, within its borders, and provides them refuge and provides them protection. And as a result, the government has a right to tax its subjects. V'chein hasar ba'ayarot shelo. And the same thing is true if there is a person who's like a land baron who owns properties, and people live on his properties by his permission. He has a right to tax those people. O shel hamelech v'nosin lo b'matana, or if it belongs to the king and the king gives him rights of collection, as long as he taxes fairly and with discrimination and with a certain fixed amount. So then he's not a gazlan, and a person has an obligation to pay their taxes. Lefichach hamavriach mimechazeh over alo sigzol. If therefore a person tries to evade paying this tax, he is in violation of thou shalt not steal. Okay, so we're going to have to clarify this very carefully, because the question is, what is the avera of tax evasion? If a person evades paying taxes, right, does he incur a sin or not? So he basically is saying that anytime you try to evade paying a fair tax that's imposed upon you, so then you're in violation of lo tigzol, because you're stealing from the king. And he says this is true, bein shu melech Yisrael, bein melech nocher. And this is true whether the king is a Jew or a non-Jew. Now, take a look at this parentheses, which is a very important caveat. And he seeks to explain what he means. Sha'af shemuter lahavkiya chova, shechayiv lenachri mikavar. He says there is a differentiation in halacha between a debt that is owed to a Jew versus a debt that is owed to a non-Jew. If I fail to pay a debt that is owed to a Jew, I'm a ganav. If I fail to pay a debt that I owe to a non-Jew, I'm not a ganav. And if there's a way for me to absolve myself, and we had seen this before, to absolve myself from paying back a debt to a Gentile, and I can do so without creating a chilul Hashem, so then I'm permitted to do so technically. And so therefore the question that he's raising is, isn't paying tax essentially a debt? So if I can figure out a way to evade paying my taxes, why are you calling me a gazlan? After all, isn't that the same thing as not paying back a debt that I owe to a Gentile? So he says, Ze eino kimafkia chovo, ela gozel mamish. He says, no, this is totally different. He says, you're mamish a gazlan if you don't pay your taxes. Shenehene me'artzo shalomi dato. And the reason why, he says, is as follows. Number one, you're benefiting from the government's land without permission, because the government only gives you permission to benefit from their services and their properties if you pay their taxes. So you're actively taking services from the government without paying your fair share of the tax. So that's what makes you a gazlan, even though you can rephrase it as evading paying a debt. But he says it's worse than just evading paying a debt. You're actively taking goods or services from the government and not paying for them. So that's number one. Umachasro mamon shaharei hayachol limkor hanaazu shel masu matan ba'artzo liish echad. And furthermore, you are depleting the coffers of the government, which the government could have given rights of, let's say you are a businessman and the government gives you the rights to engage in your business, gives you a license to sell widgets, okay? And the government expects you, in exchange for having that right to sell widgets and within its borders, that you pay taxes for that. And if you don't, you're basically taking away the government's opportunity to give that license to someone else who will sell widgets and pay taxes for that privilege of selling widgets. So, and it's not just selling widgets, it's engaging in any profession, right? The government gives you a license or a right to engage in a certain business, and it does so with the expectation that you will pay back the taxes. If you fail to do that, you're basically taking that right to engage in that business without paying your fair tax in exchange for that. So there is a quid pro quo that makes you an active gazlan by not paying back what you owe the government. Okay.
Rabbi, sometimes
yes.
That's really impractical because, like, for example, many people have a cleaning lady, and I don't know anybody who doesn't pay their cleaning lady with cash, or other situations like that. It's just not practical.
Okay. I think that when we get into the details, we're going to have to go through those scenarios. What right do people have to pay their cleaning lady without paying her taxes? It's an excellent question, and it's an important question because it becomes a slippery slope. Once it becomes permissible, if we're going to find a heter for you to pay your cleaning lady without paying taxes, what's going to be the heter to purchase a car without paying taxes, or to make a simcha and pay a caterer without paying the HST? Okay, so these are all things that we have to look at very, very carefully. First of all, it may be necessary, the onus may be on the merchant, not on the consumer. And we'll have to see. In other words, my cleaning lady, she's the one who has to pay the taxes because she has the privilege of working in Canada. If she charges me a certain amount, is it my obligation to make sure that she pays her taxes or not? So that's an interesting question that we have to look into, right? But here we're talking about the person that is the purveyor of goods or the purveyor of services. That person has been granted the opportunity by the government to provide those goods or services within its borders. That person has an obligation to pay taxes for that right. Okay, so that's what we've seen so far. Va'od, shehamelech muchsaku b'ameh shemagia lo me'avadav, ho'ol v'hiskimu olav b'nei osa haaretz. He says the king or the government really is considered to be the muchzak. Now, the word muchzak in halacha, we've seen this word before, is a person who is considered the possessor of property and or possessor of any monetary value. And for when we talk about the term muchzak, it's a legal term because basically, if you and I have a dispute as to whether you owe me money or not, you have an advantage by definition of the fact that you are the muchzak on the property in question. If let's say I say you owe me $20 and you say I don't owe you $20, the burden of proof is upon me in order to extract the money from you. We say hamotze mechavero olav haraya, that if I want to extract money from a muchzak, from a person who's in possession, then the burden of proof is on the person who wishes to be the extractor. And essentially what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is arguing is that you may think that the king is the person who's trying to extract taxes from you, but it's just the opposite. The king is considered the possessor, the muchzak, of what is owed to him from his subjects, hol v'hiskimul of b'nei osa haaretz, since that has become the convention of all of the citizenry to pay taxes. Once everyone agrees by consensus that they're going to pay the government taxes, then the government now becomes the assumed or the presumed owner of that percentage of your assets, because that has now become the national convention. And everyone has basically consented, or tacitly, that the king is their sort of their lord or their overseer, and we are his subjects. And therefore everything that we own, in a sense, is subjugated or has a lien on it to the king or to the government. And therefore, any merchandise that I obtain, there's an assumed lien on it, on a percentage of that property that belongs to the king. So that he can extract tax from it. And it's as if it's in his possession. So therefore, the whole halacha of hafka'ah salva, of trying to evade or absolve yourself of paying tax, that argument that it's okay to do that to a Gentile does not work here, because evading paying a debt is when there's a presumption that the Jew is the muchzak, is the possessor of the property, and he's trying to evade paying what he owes in a debt to a non-Jew. But here, where there's an actual lien on all of my property, so it's as if the government actually is holding on to, or is the possessor of that object, and by my not giving to the government what is owed to them, then I am really a gazlan. Kevin shehi ba'artzo ve'etzel avdo, and therefore it's considered to be because it's in the king's property, and the king has officers overseeing that property, meaning the land which I live in. It's as if it's already in the king's possession. And therefore, if I don't pay my taxes, it's as if it's tantamount to actually taking and stealing money from the coffers of the king. Now, one may argue politically, that this may not be exactly how democracies work, how governments work where there's no monarchy. It's unclear. But at the end of the day, the Rav Shulchan Aruch has made a very, very strong argument that tax evasion is gezela. It's actual stealing. So that's the first opinion that he puts forward. And when we continue this halacha Mirz Hashem tomorrow, we're going to see a second opinion that is more lenient on tax evasion and does not view it as actual gezela. But I hope that this has put the fear of God in everyone's as we get started on this halacha, and then we'll continue. All right.
So we should have done this 3 weeks ago before April 30th.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, all you can do now is feel guilty if you have. Well, yes. Didn't they grant extensions to people?
Not this year, I don't think. Last year.
Okay. All right.
But I think you can always pay late. They'll always accept it.
All right.